So applying this to the case of Central Asia, what we see here is that the key feature the Soviets ultimately used to create nation-based identities was linguistic. This was the lowest common denominator. You had clan-based identities that divided people of the same language group, and you had differences between nomads and settled peoples, differences in religious identification, customs, ways of life as a result of the nomad versus settled people's differences, and language was really an aggregator in each region. And at the same time, it could help differentiate between these various quote-unquote Turkic peoples. They all spoke a Turkic tongue, except for the Tajiks down here. All these were people who spoke a Turkic language, and now you could identify some sort of differences between these groups and aggregate the groups within amongst themselves. So in other words, bring the Uzbeks together and separate them from the Kazakhs and Turkmen, etc. This was one of the reasons for this was again that sort of classic divide and rule tactics that the Russians had been using before and now the Soviets took on. Even at this point though, this was really hard because these entities that they created ultimately were largely multi-ethnic. So they had various tongues within them. So take, for example, the case of Tashkent. This is Tashkent over here, capital of the Uzbek Republic and now the country of Uzbekistan. It was largely an Uzbek city, but it was surrounded by Kazakhs. So who should get it? Where did they want to put this? Local elites thought that boundary delimitation was a good opportunity to get more land from their neighbors. So people were fighting over this as it took place. And Tashkent did ultimately go to the Uzbeks. So you had this demarcation along linguistic borders, which gave us 5 Central Asian republics and created the first ever Central Asian proto-states. These states didn't exist before the early 20th century. The Soviets created these proto-states that would then go on to, after 1991, become independent countries. These things didn't exist at all before. There was no identity for them to exist before. Remember, we were talking about khanates that spanned across these various territories, the Bukharan Khanate, for example, the Khivan Khanate. So the first one, we'll start with Uzbekistan because it's the most populous. And in 1924, the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic was created. It is ethnically divided between Turkic and Persian peoples. They got part of the Bukharan People's Republic and also part of the Khwarezm People's Republic based in Khiva, as you recall. Turkmenistan, to the south here, was created in 1927. This was a desert. It was largely earthquake-prone. There was a strong sense of tribal affiliation, so it was very factional. They also got part of the Khwarezm People's Republic, which they split with Uzbekistan. Tajikistan was created in 1929. It's about the size of Florida over here. It's very mountainous. And they also got part of the Bukharan People's Republic. So again, we're taking the Bukharan People's Republic as part of the Bukharan Khanate, and now we're taking that and separating it. So it's not necessarily a very logical separation. The Kyrgyz in 1936 gained republic status. So Kyrgyzstan over here. It's very small. It's about the size of Nebraska. It's beautiful. It's considered the Switzerland of Central Asia. I was only in a little piece of Kyrgyzstan whenever the border is over here. In the Fergana Valley. Many of the Basmachis that we talked about in the last class, these rebels, which we'll talk about again today, were Kyrgyz. And the Kyrgyz got really the short end of the stick because they lost much of the Fergana Valley, this sort of oasis area that had the most fertile land. And they lost it mostly to Uzbekistan, who were seen as more settled, less nomadic peoples. And instead, the Kyrgyz, got the mountains. Okay, so beautiful mountains, but not as much agriculture, obviously. So Kazakhstan, as I noted before, it was actually the Kyrgyz Republic for a while. This Kazakhstan in 1920 had become an autonomous region. In 1936, it became a republic. It was always considered separate under the Soviet Union since all the way back into Russia. So even before the Soviet Union, in the Russian Empire. It's a huge area, 2.7 million square kilometers, so it's about twice the size of Texas. Or if you want to consider a bunch of states, it's the size of Arizona, Colorado, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Utah. Huge, huge territory. So all these republics, ultimately there are about 15, are a bit like states in a federal system. That's one way to think about them. during the Soviet period. They're sort of like states in the federal system. Now, there were several functions of demarcation when we talk about the Nationality Policy from 1922 to 1934. They were creating ethnic or nationality-based republics, and the most benign reason for this was that you could satisfy local demands for national recognition. This was the most benign way of looking at this. Another thing was that it was important. It was it could help actually facilitate organization and planning, break down the Soviet Union into smaller units. Because remember, this is important, where everything is centrally run. The entire economy and all the politics are centrally run. It's important to have some pieces instead of just one big block. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the economy was run or failed to run in a few minutes. But going back to this idea of local demands for national recognition, the reason this is so important because early on they spoke of self-determination, equality, and sovereignty. It was one of the tools they used to try to gain the support of locals against Tsarism and against the whites during the Civil War. So here you could have this self-determination sort of placating the locals. And Stalin at this point was in charge of ethnicity policy. And so Stalin really designed this. Excuse me. At the more sinister level, though, what we're talking about really is using republics to help separate hostile and anti-communist tribal units. Again, this is about divide and rule. So disrupt potential alliances among groups that might pose a threat to Soviet power. And this is especially important when we're talking about the Jadids and the young Bukharins. So going back to this, what you're doing is you're creating national units that essentially compete with one another. And so this fosters local animosities. You have the Uzbek Republic going against the Tajik Republic, going against the Turkmen Republic and the Kyrgyz Republic and the Kazakh Republic. And this reduces the likelihood of any traditional attachments to clan or religion, much less any regional identity. So you're eliminating the likelihood of a pan-Turkic identity forming. And that was one of the fears, that a pan-Turkic identity could ultimately derail the Soviet power within Central Asia. So again, this is important because they allied themselves, the communists allied themselves with the Jadids and the young Bukharins in order to come to power. So a final element here is that they created vested and localized interests in the new system. So what they're doing is they're creating loyalties. They're creating loyalties between each republic and Moscow, where all the power is dispensed, and the economic benefits as well. So, in essence, they hoped that by strengthening the various nationalities in the Soviet Union, they could do a couple things. One, gain more favor from ethnic groups, and two, use these ethnic groups to spread the communist ideology in a more sort of local way. So this is what we mean by this crutch in the march to communism. So the crutch argument was this idea that you needed to use people's own native languages and cultural understandings in order to take on their own bourgeoisie at home and topple their own bourgeoisie. This was not, they didn't seek to encourage overtly Russian nationalism at the time, but nationalism for the oppressed, which would let them pull themselves up. So that was the idea behind this crutch. Let them use their own their own language, their own culture, their own history in order to fight for communism. And this would foment greater trust in the new state and encourage entry into the still being built universal culture, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, this is the Homo Sovieticus. All this was designed to be temporary. So nationalities were designed to be temporary. This nationalism, these local nationalisms were designed to be temporary, and eventually everyone would be one nation, Homo Sovieticus, this one Soviet man. Central Asia wasn't the only region that was defined along ethnic or national lines at the time. You had numerous very small autonomous districts that were created to house the respected nationalities across the Soviet Union and across Russia in particular. Russia had tons of these. There were more than 190 languages that in the 1920s were slated to all become official languages. So this is much different than what we think of when we think of the Soviet Union today, which was this dominance of the Russians. At first, they had this nationality policy that was supposed to push communism by exploiting differences between these various groups. Now, this was complicated. It was complicated for a bunch of reasons. You had local language newspapers that were all carrying the same party line, but you had all these different languages. You had educational facilities. Educational facilities had to be run for each different group. So imagine in a place like Bukhara, where you've got three different groups, three different ethnic groups or linguistic groups trying to cater to these various groups through their own educational institutions. Same thing with cultural institutions. For the Uzbeks, the Karakalpaks, the Kazakhs, the Crimeans, the Jews, the Bashkirs, the Kalmyks, the Chukchis, the list goes on. So this was very complicated to administer, and it also breeds a long-term trend of nationalism, because this was a dangerous game the Soviets were playing. Because at the same time that they were trying to use nationalism and break down peoples to fight one another, and also to move towards a common ideology without allying with one another, this created long-term trends of nationalism. This created the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Kazakhs, out of something that really didn't exist so much before. So Stalin's definition of nation really condemned proto-nations from the pre-1934 era to disappearance, because the way he defined nation was a, quote, historically constituted stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. So nation was not racial or tribal, which excludes a primordial definition. A primordial definition of ethnicity or nation is that you are born into a nation. It's by blood, versus an instrumental idea of nation, which is that you can change by identification with these different groups. But now what Stalin was doing is saying you can't be born into being an Uzbek, you can't be born into being a Kazakh, etc. He focused on common language, and he denied that a nation could simultaneously speak two languages. And this was great because Russia would be the lingua franca in the Soviet Union. It helped to denationalize Soviet ethnicities in the long run. These various groups shared a common territory, internal economic bond, and Stalin would play this up later a lot. This common economic life, the economic cohesion of the entire Soviet group, not just these little nationalities. Remember, Marxism and Leninism, of course, is all about economics. But they also have to have this common national character. And if you look at the cultural outflow from Russia to the periphery that was already done in the Russian Empire and further encouraged in the Soviet Union, this common national character is really about, this common culture is really about this Soviet man. So this is Stalin's grand definition, which shrewdly notes that, quote, a nation, like every historical phenomenon, is subject to the law of change. In other words, it can begin and end. And this is what I mean by an instrumental definition of ethnicity, the rise and fall of these ethnic groups. A primordial identification of ethnicity suggests that ethnicities is constantly passed along in blood, and the only way for it to die is through a genocide. So for Stalin, it's easy for an ethnic group to come out, to rise up, such as Homo Sovieticus, this Soviet man. It's also easy for one to die, such as the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz and the Turkmen. They can go away just like that. I snapped if you didn't hear it. So this clears the way for Soviet men, which we're going to discuss in a couple minutes. And all this is important to understanding nationality policy from 1934 to 1991. All this playing up of nationalities really ends around 1934, when Stalin declares that the future has just arrived. We now have this new sort of Soviet man in the workings. So essential differences have been overcome in just a decade and a half, and now nationality is no longer useful. It's also an administrative nightmare, again going back to the 190 plus groups that you have maintaining some sort of autonomy within the Soviet Union. This was a big pain. And so in the 1936 Constitution, also known as the Stalin Constitution, there's more centralization of power. It's important here. They've got this facade of freedom, so they increase the rights of republics. these bigger blocks. So get rid of the little ethnicities, the little nations within these groups, and now it's just the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and et cetera, et cetera. So they increased the rights of republics on paper. Republics could secede in theory, according to Stalin's constitution. Of course, it'd be very difficult to do this. They also created conditions for being a republic. You had to be on the external border of the Soviet Union. You had to be a national group with a majority of that territory's population, and the population had to be at least 1 million people. So now we're getting rid of some of the smaller puzzle pieces, these smaller ethnic groups that were nations. Now they're absorbed into something else. So obviously only a handful of the 190 plus small autonomous districts could remain after the 1930s. What you ended up getting is 53 titular nationalities, in other words, nationalities that had a title over their territory. 15 of which of these were actually republics, so they were these sort of states in this federal system. These were increasingly celebrated, and they created a de facto social pecking order. So here you've got the center, of course, run by Moscow at this point. And within the center, you've got the first secretary versus the second secretary, the Politburo versus Supreme Soviet. And then you've got this titular nationality. So the titular nationality is the empowered one, the privileged one. So think about at the republic level. At the republic level, when we're talking about this, these are much like nations, but they owed their allegiance and their positions to the center, back to Moscow, which had the power to give and take. And finally, you had the non-titular nationalities, those that were unempowered, that had been disempowered by the Constitution of 1936. They were much more limited in power, and so they had greater pressures for assimilation. And they were constantly competing with the titular nationalities over scarce resources. So again, the scarce resources like money, jobs, positions of power. Just to rehash this, by titular nationalities, so the center is Moscow. The titular nationality, that, for example, with the republic status, so that in Kazakhstan, the titular nationality are the Kazakhs, and then the non-titular nationalities within Kazakhstan could be Uzbeks, they could be Kyrgyz, they could be Russians, but the Russians have a much greater position, their enhanced status, because they are the sort of prototype for the new Soviet man. But before I get to that, just to go back to this for a second, these nationality-based privileges in the Soviet system. So throughout the USSR, nationality becomes important in everything from education to employment to promotions. In your passport, it's stamped what nationality you are. And if you're the titular nationality within the republic, you're going to have benefits relative to the non-titular nationality. Except for a period when there was sort of an affirmative action program going on. If you're the titular nationality in one of the outlying republics, you're not going to have the same benefits in the center as the Russians are going to have, since the center is located within Russia. So all this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, really, because administrative borders change identities. Where administrative units had been created for allegedly already present nationalities at the start, by World War II, these units were the defining unit. So in the Russian Republic, for example, you had an autonomous area known as Kalmykia. I am from Kalmykia. I am a Kalmyk. Nationalism in the late Soviet period was fundamentally shaped by this phenomenon. And this is why we get the Uzbeks standing up for an independent Uzbekistan in 1991. And the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Turkmen, the Tajiks, the same thing going on here. So, again, as all this is going on, you also have these efforts to build this Soviet man, this Homo Sovieticus. So they went from separate but equal, so all these equal nationalities, to separate but increasingly unequal, as the Russians, this sort of Russian chauvinism takes on the lead role. Interestingly, Stalin, who orchestrated all this, was actually an ethnic Georgian, but Russians had become identified with the Soviet man prototype. They were the largest nationality by numbers. They were the most advanced. They had the most advanced literature. Russian was always the language of science in the Russian Empire. They were the historic masters from the Russian Empire. They were always sort of in charge. And so there were many aspects to this. I'll just show a little map here as we talk about this. You had this common lingua franca, Russian. This allowed for borderless travel within the Soviet Union, and frequently they would send people to the quote-unquote domestic abroad, the near abroad. But you had very difficult travel restrictions to get out of the Soviet Union. You had an internationalization of the workforce and educational opportunities. So you had all these people, all these Kazakhs who would go study in Russia. And the movement of peoples, I guess, is what really this is all about. And this was quite overt, the movement of peoples. And the movement of peoples diluted these various national populations. So you had Russians moving from all over Russia into places like Belarus, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and especially into Central Asia, Kazakhstan especially, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. And what you're doing here is you're diluting the local population to the point that in Turkmenistan, the national population went from about 73% Turkmen in 1926 to about 65% in 1970. In Kazakhstan during that period, you're talking about 52% of the Kazakh population being actually ethnically Kazakh to only 33% of the population, as you had more and more of this flow, this internationalized, and internationalized I mean internation literally, but within the Soviet Republic, the Soviet Union, this internationalized people going from republic to republic and sort of inhabiting these republics and changing the character and really enhancing and pushing forward this idea that we are all Soviet man, Soviet Homo Sovieticus. So what this really meant in Central Asia was quicker Russification, a new wave of Russification in Central Asia, which could be compared to the late Tsarist period. This was part of this broader process designed to hinder elements of the old culture, get rid of the old culture, shut down religious schools, change the alphabet. And we'll talk about this in a couple of minutes when we talk about religion. Change the alphabet so that earlier elements of culture become inaccessible, literally inaccessible. We can't even read what that is. Purge elites, attack on traditional values more broadly. So in Central Asia, emancipate women, neglect and destroy traditional art forms. All these things that were designed to undermine the local nations. An important note here is that Russification was much quicker in the urban areas than in rural parts of Central Asia, and elsewhere for that matter, because first of all, there were already more Russians who had come during the colonial period. A concentrated population also made it much easier to build more modes of cultural transfer. For example, Russian language schools, theaters, concert halls where everything was in Russian. You also had stronger conservative forces in the small towns, pretty much everywhere, where they had a traditional socioeconomic status, lower levels of education, lower income, so subsistence, lower mobility, which meant that people really stayed much more insulated in these areas. And especially in the cities, you had those who were looking for upward social mobility. And being a member of the Communist Party was key to that. And to be a good member of the Communist Party, you had to be a good Russian speaker. You had to adopt this Homo Sovieticus culture. And all this has lingering effects today. I remember when I was in Uzbekistan, and the Uzbeks were playing the Russians one day in soccer, and then a couple weeks later they were playing the Kazakhs and a U.S. game. I was asking who do you support? The U.S. they didn't actually play, but I threw out this question: who would you support if the Uzbeks were playing the Russians, the U.S. team, the Kazakhs? And every time they had a preference for the Russians, despite, or perhaps because of this colonial history, these ties that have been created. So eventually you get this map, which you're looking at right here, and you've been looking at for a while, and this is the Soviet Union. So I'll take another slide, and we'll give you a quick picture of life in the Soviet Union.